Welcome back to our last video in the first unit. So it's the last thing we need to know, looking at primary storage, obviously the last video being about secondary storage. So hopefully you can recall RAM and ROM from GCSE. So what does it stand for? So we've got random access memory, which is volatile, and ROM, which is read-only memory, which is non-volatile. We store our current running programs and their data in RAM, and we store the BIOS, and depending on the device, it might actually be program code in ROM. When we turn the computer off, RAM gets wiped, ROM does not. RAM, we can read and write data to it, ROM, we cannot. So RAM, when we open a program and look at the various programs in Task Manager, for example, they are copied from RAM, into RAM from secondary storage. So you might take a game from your hard drive or your SSD and put it into RAM, and then those documents, the data we're using, can also be opened up by copying them into RAM as well, and your RAM starts to fill up. So we said it's running programs and their data. So current running programs and their data, don't just put programs, you won't get the mark. If you run out of RAM, you might be able to remember we have a thing called virtual memory, where we essentially use a part of our secondary storage device, which is much slower and it's not very efficient, but we can use that as like temporary RAM. It's called virtual memory, but we don't want that to happen really. You always want to have enough RAM. Primary storage, most of the time, is volatile, and it usually refers to RAM. Secondary storage refers to the devices in the previous video. As I've already said, we've got magnetic, such as a hard disk, optical storage, using laser light, such as CD-ROM, and solid state, using flash memory. Now, your normal RAM that you're used to, is dynamic RAM. Okay, we use a series of transistors and capacitors, and essentially, a capacitor is like a battery, and that provides the energy temporarily, the electricity. The transistor regulates that flow. Essentially, one capacitor and one transistor is used to store data for 1 bit. If it's got a charge, it's equal to a 1, else it's a 0. And that transistor determines whether or not the capacitor needs to be recharged. So essentially, RAM needs to be constantly refreshed and charged. That's why if you turn your computer off, it forgets everything. But it's good for storage, it's really small, but we've got to refresh them often, so it uses more power. Static RAM is created from using things called flip-flops, which is essentially a bunch of logic gates. It's more often used in things like cache memory or embedded systems. It's static because once it receives that charge, it keeps it until the computer turns off. Now, it's much faster than DRAM, but it stores less data than DRAM because there's more components to it. It uses less power, but it's more expensive. That's why if you've got a CPU with lots of cache, it costs a lot more money. Little diagram there. Static has 4 chips essentially, or 4 devices. Dynamic just has that capacitor with the transistor as well. So for 1 bit, static's going to have 4 transistors, dynamic's only going to have the 1. So going to ROM, we use it as a BIOS chip because that software doesn't need to be changed. But we also used to use them for games. Pokemon, for example, that is stored on the ROM chip because why would you change the game's code? You wouldn't. NES games such as Duck Hunt, things like that, exactly the same. Now, there's 3 types of ROM. You're not necessarily going to get actively asked about these, but you've got programmable ROM, so you can change them. You've got EEPROM, which is erasable programmable ROM, so you can delete them. And then you've got EEPROM, which is electrically erasable programmable ROM. And there we go. We're getting shorter, 3 minutes and 50 seconds. So hopefully that was a nice whiz through. Of course, these videos are simple revision to jog your memory. I do recommend you go to your course book, to your teacher's resources, or if you're in my classes, one of my resources. As I say, it's just to refresh your memory and make sure you've got something you can revise from. Please like and subscribe. Leave some comments if you've got a question. I have no problems with answering them. So go ahead and do that. So thanks a lot, and I will see you in the next video.